World War II was a watershed moment in American Indian history, much like World War I, but even more so for various reasons. A lot of Native Americans served in the military. A lot of Native women volunteered, and a lot of young American Indian men served in combat. Some of them serving in the Code Talkers. Now, back in World War I, the Choctaws had provided the Code Talkers. This is a situation where a unit would have a Choctaw Indian assigned to them who would send the radio transmissions in code, and then when they were received on the other side, there would be a Choctaw there who would translate for the officers, so that even if the Germans broke the code, they still had to understand the Choctaw language, which they did not. Now, Choctaws weren't used as much. I think that some of them were still used, but not primarily Choctaws in World War II, because everyone knew they'd been used in World War I. Navajos were used to a large extent, although there were many other tribes, including Comanches, Cherokees, and others who served as code talkers. Also, though, I mean, there were American Indians serving in uniform that weren't beyond just the code talkers. One of those was Ira Hayes. And there's a picture of him. Actually, it's two pictures of him, but you can see his face on the right. Ira Hayes, who was a Pima Indian, was a U.S. Marine who fought on Iwo Jima and was one of the Marines in the famous photograph raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. And the arrow there is pointing to which one he is. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that these aren't the original guys that first raised the flag on that mountain, which was the highest spot in Iwo Jima. Essentially, what had happened is that they sent some Marines up there and they put up a flag, and then afterwards the officers were like, oh man, we should have taken a picture of that. So they sent some more up to put up a bigger flag, and this was them that were captured in that famous photograph. But that's not to take away from the fact that all the Marines in both those situations had been fighting and continued fighting. The fighting went on. In fact, some of these guys in the picture didn't live through that week. Ira Hayes did, and he became a prominent spokesperson. All the people in this photograph were the ones that survived the battle were celebrities, and they were used to sell war bonds and stuff. So Ira Hayes became very well known. He had kind of a tragic life. He had a lot of PTSD issues from the war. He also had a lot of survivor's guilt because so many of his comrades had died in that battle that had such heavy casualties. In fact, he actually pressed to be released from that war bond drive and allowed to go back into combat with his comrades. At the end of the war, he had a hard time, and eventually became an alcoholic and died of he drank himself to death or died of exposure. It's hard to say which one, which is a sad end for such an individual. Although he did have a song written about him by Johnny Cash, and not many people can say that. And he was one of the main characters in the film Flags of Our Fathers, which I referenced earlier when we were talking about Iwo Jima. Now, I said this was a watershed moment for American Indians, and I alluded to World War I. World War I was important in Native history and culture. World War II even more so, because it lasted so much longer, and there were so many more people mobilized. And what that meant for young American Indian men, who were not segregated, by the way, unlike Japanese Americans and African Americans, Native Americans who were drafted or who joined, and large numbers of them joined voluntarily, they were serving in units along with white and also Latino soldiers. So that meant, for one thing, that a a lot of white people who served got to know some Native Americans whom they probably would never have met otherwise, and never would have realized that they were real people that still existed. But even more important than that, American Indians from different tribes, from different parts of the country, who probably also would never have met, got to meet one another, form connections, sort of compare notes about their particular experiences back home. And this had a couple of different results. One was that the social connections that developed continued after the war, and pretty quickly thereafter, considering the fact that Roosevelt had undone all those cultural restrictions that had been placed on Indians practicing their culture. The powwow circuit started to develop, a social network around the country. But equally significant was the political connections that were made. A lot of Native Americans from different tribes became closely connected and became became activists, and had a network of other people, other Native activists in other parts of the country that they could communicate with. And this would help to develop that Native activism initially. That was evident in the National Congress of American Indians in the 1940s and beyond, that eventually in the 1960s and 70s would lay the groundwork for what would become known as the Red Power movement. The situation with African Americans in World War II was very similar to the situation in World War I that we discussed earlier, which is to say that they were segregated, that they were kind of relegated to support roles for the most part, a lot of driving trucks and building roads and bridges. Although, just like in World War I, there were some regiments, all-black regiments, that saw a lot of combat, including the 92nd Infantry, nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers. They had kind of inherited that name from the 9th and 10th Cavalry. This was one of the same regiments, all-black regiments, that had fought so much in France in World War I. And this time, there were also black pilots, black airmen, the Tuskegee Airmen, who were a fighter squadron who had really just an outstanding record in protecting the bombers in their charge throughout the war. In some ways, the civil rights movement that we normally associate with the 1950s and 1960s, that we specifically associate with starting in the mid-50s, really got its start during World War II. And one of the individuals who was most active in that was this guy, A. Philip Randolph, who had been, since actually World War I, he had been active in civil rights things. He had organized and became the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a union. Sleeping car porters were those guys on the trains who, a porter means someone who carries stuff. So they were the guys, and they had the little uniforms, you can see them on the right there, who would carry your baggage onto the train. And if you were in one of the sleeping cars, where it's like a rolling motel room, they attended to your needs. They were not all African American, but most of them were. So this union was almost entirely a black union. So you've got civil rights and labor, which are very closely tied together. Anyway, in 1941, as the situation was worsening in Europe, the London Blitz was on, Randolph had proposed that actually he and others had asked for the federal government to end segregation, to do something about it, and kind of to get the attention of the president and of Washington. Randolph organized a massive march on Washington, reminiscent of the march a decade or so earlier that those World War I veterans had, trying to, to get their message out. And it was all organized and it was planned, but it was so effective they didn't actually have to do it because Roosevelt did not want the bad press of this, and so he actually gave in to some of their demands, kind of preemptively. And what he did was he banned discrimination in any defense jobs. Well, the country is gearing up for war. Many of the most important jobs in the country were defense jobs. So this was really a big step. It didn't end segregation, but it did put a big dent in it in the workplace. So A. Philip Randolph was, he was one of several people who were sort of heroes to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and whom he modeled his approach on. And in fact, later on, 22 years after it was initially proposed, as you are no doubt aware, there was a massive March on Washington in 1963. That's where Dr. King gave his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And guess who helped organize that one? And guess who led the march? A. Philip Randolph. During the war, many African American civil rights leaders and black newspapers called for something called the Double V. Now, first I got to stop a second and just talk about what a weird concept that is. Black newspapers. Because newspapers are newspapers, right? White paper, black ink. And yet there were certain newspapers that were geared primarily, exclusively really, toward an all-black audience. So the Double V, victory, two victories, victory abroad, rather, across the ocean against fascism, and victory at home against fascism, against racism. So it seemed kind of a double standard to be going off across the ocean to fight for liberty and to end fascism. And remember what we talked about, fascism, it's ultra-nationalism, and it goes hand in hand with racism, and yet have Jim Crow segregation laws at home. In fact, the Jim Crow segregation laws were kind of a blueprint for Hitler, for some of his laws about Jewish people at the beginning of his administration. So victory at home, victory abroad. There was also a call for black internationalism. Primarily, this was coming from leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Black internationalism meant not just a call for African American rights, but also, and this is kind of reminiscent to what Marcus Garvey had been calling for, despite the fact that Garvey and Du Bois didn't get along that well. Du Bois was kind of changing as well. So not just African American, but solidarity between people of African descent all around the world, and not only that, colonized people. So it was kind of pairing desegregation and civil rights in America with decolonization, ending the practice of European countries and other countries beyond Europeans, basically having these imperial agendas and controlling peoples in other lands, particularly African descended people. Also, during the war in 1944, a book came out called An American Dilemma. It was by a Swedish sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal, who, sometimes an outsider can see things more clearly because insiders can't see the forest for the trees. Myrdal wrote this book. It was the subheading was "The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy." Essentially, a book about race problems, race issues in the United States. One of the things that he found out doing his sociological study. And by the way, historians love sociologists because they do all the math. They do all the counting and the numbers and stuff, and then we can use it. One of the things that he discovered was that when asked the question, do you think black people are happy in America? When asked that question, the overwhelming majority of white people in America said, sure. And oddly enough, when that question was asked of black people, the answer was quite different. Most of them were, the vast majority of them, not happy at all with how things were. And this book, when it came out, was a big seller, and it was kind of like a brick upside the head, I guess you could say, for a lot of Americans. Just shocking, absolutely shocking why black people aren't happy. Of course, they had never bothered to ask any, is the problem. And that really was a big part of the problem. However, this book, as well as a lot of the efforts being made by people in the black community, went a long way toward making Americans more aware of the racial problems that did exist. Another thing that helped make Americans more aware was fighting in the war. Fighting in the war, particularly there toward the end when in Europe, Germany was defeated and all those concentration camps were liberated. People had been leaking rumors about this, and a lot of people refused to believe it, but there was the evidence. Horrible, horrifying evidence that the whole world saw pictures of. And that right there was a really, really hard wake-up call for what it can lead to if you have a government that is set up on ideas of a superior race. So all this is kind of setting the stage for some changes in attitudes after the war.